हेलो दोस्तों, वेलकम टू ललित टेक्निकल यूट्यूब चैनल। प्लीज़ लाइक एंड सब्सक्राइब द चैनल। टुडे वी कैन आज हम देखेंगे डॉट नेट इंटरव्यू क्वेश्चन जो इंटरव्यूअर द्वारा पूछे जाते हैं। ठीक है, तो बेसिक क्वेश्चन पहले देखते हैं इंटरव्यूअर क्या क्या क्वेश्चन लेते हैं। तो पहला क्वेश्चन है, व्हाट इज़ द डॉट नेट फ्रेमवर्क, व्हाट इज़ द फेयर कॉमन लैंग्वेज रन टाइम, what is the CTS common time system, what is the difference between .NET framework, .NET core and .NET 5.6.7, what are value types of reference types in .NET, what is the difference between abstract class and interface, what are assemblies and namespace, what is a managed and unmanaged code, what is JIT compilation in .NET, what is delegates, what is the difference between delegates and event, what is an exe and dll, what is the difference between int and int32। और नेक्स्ट क्वेश्चन देखते हैं। डॉट नेट में बेसिक क्वेश्चन आते हैं, इंटरव्यू द्वारा पूछे जाने वाले क्वेश्चन है ये। What is the difference between constant, read-only and static? What is boxing and unboxing? What is the use of where dynamic and object types? Explain the use of uh, async and await in C#. What is the difference between equal and equals in C#? What are access modifier in C#? What is the difference between override and new override in C#? What is a null type? What is a link queue in C#? What are extension in method? ये सारे क्वेश्चन इंटरव्यू में पूछे जाते हैं। तो ज़्यादा क्वेश्चन पूछने वाले क्वेश्चन हैं डिफरेंस बिटवीन कांस्टेंट एंड रीड ओनली, स्टैटिक, async and await keyword, equal and double equal, null type, difference between override and new keyword. That's all out that question. सीनियर लेवल पोजीशन के लिए क्वेश्चन है, व्हाट आर द मेन फीचर्स ऑफ .NET Core, .NET 6 and 7, what is the dependency injection in .NET, what are middleware and the request pipeline in ASP.NET C# Core, how do you implement logging in .NET Core, what is garbage collection and how does it works in .NET, how do you implement a custom exception filter in ASP.NET Core, explain async, await and the task parallel library TPL, what is the difference between task and thread, what is the difference between transit scoped and singleton service in DI, what is signal R and where it is used। ASP.NET and ASP.NET क्वेश्चन के लिए, what is the difference between ASP.NET MVC and ASP.NET Core, what are tag helper in ASP.NET Core, what is view state and does ASP.NET Core use it, what is Roger page, how is it different from MVC, how do you handle session and cookies in ASP.NET Core, how how is the role of AppSetting JSON is AppSetting ASP.NET Core, how do you secure a web API in ASP.NET Core, how is routing handled in ASP.NET Core, what are filters in ASP.NET Core, how do you consume web API in .NET application, what is the order of event in page life cycle in ASP.NET। ये अक्सर पूछने जाने वाले क्वेश्चन है, ठीक है। What is the garbage collector, what is caching, explain MVC, what is ISC, ISS, what is Kestrel, what is the purpose of the startup class, what is delegate package manager, what is the MVC pattern, what is the entity framework, what is a RESTful web service or web API, what is routing and how can you define routes in ASP.NET Core, explain the concept of middleware in ASP.NET Core, what is a cookie, explain how dependency injection works in ASP.NET Core, what is dependency injection, what are the difference between that implement the result interface. एंटिटी फ्रेमवर्क से क्वेश्चन है, व्हाट इज एंटिटी फ्रेमवर्क कोर, व्हाट इज द डिफरेंस बिटवीन ईएफ कोर एंड ईएफ 6, what is the migration in EF core, how do you configure relation one to many, many to many, what is lazy loading, edge loading and explicit loading, how to handle concurrency in EF core, what is the repository pattern, how to execute raw SQL queries using EF core, describe challenge in fixing .NET application, how do you manage version control in .NET project, explain your approach to unit testing in .NET, have you worked with microservice in .NET, how do you ensure performance and scalability in .NET application. API से रिलेटेड क्वेश्चन बेसिकली पूछे जाते हैं, व्हाट इज एन API, व्हाट इज REST API, व्हाट इज द HTTP मेथड सपोर्ट इन REST, what is the difference between put and post, what are the main components of an HTTP request, what is the status code 200 201 400 401 403 404 and 500, what is the difference between REST and SOAP API, what is the URI and what is a URL, what is JSON and why it is used in API, what is identity in REST, ASP.NET Core specific question. How do you create a web API in ASP.NET Core? What is the use of API controller attribute? What is route in ASP.NET Core web API? How do you return different status codes from a controller? What is the difference between IAction result and action result T? How do you handle model validation in web API? How do you bind complex type in query string and body? What is middleware in ASP.NET Core? What are filters, authorization, resource exception? What is dependency injection and how is it used in web API? Authentication and authorization in API. What is the difference between authentication and authorization? How do you secure a web API in ASP.NET Core? What is JWT, JSON Web Token? What does token based authentication work? What is OAuth and OpenID Connect? How do you implement role based authentic authorization? How do you configure core in ASP.NET Core Web API? What is API key authentication? How to handle sensitive data in API handlers or body? What is HTTPS and why is it required for APIs? How do you version a web API? How do you best practice for RESTful API design? How do you handle exception handling in web API? What is Swagger with Open API? How do you do? How is a Swagger and Open AI? How do you document a web API? What is hottest in REST API? How do you implement rate limiting in web API? How do you unit testing an API controller? How do you handle large file upload in an API? How do you catch API response in ASP.NET Core? Real world question. How would you handle version changes in a public API without breaking existing client? How do you handle multiple file uploads securely? A client report a 401 error. How do you debugging it? How do you log and monitor API request and performance? How do you design an API for mobile application with limited connectivity? How do you implement search filter short pagination in an API? What if user update the same resource simultaneously? How do you protect an API from brute force brute force attack in misuse? How do you migrate from basic authentication to JWT? How do you deploy and is- scale high traffic web API? इस इसमें ऑल सभी क्वेश्चन को आप एक बार जो एक्सपीरियंस है और नॉन एक्सपीरियंस पर्सन है वो इंटरव्यू के लिए तैयार कर सकते हैं। और आपका और कुछ क्वेरी होगा इंटरव्यू क्वेश्चन से रिलेटेड तो आप कमेंट कर सकते हैं और लाइक एंड सब्सक्राइब जरूर करें चैनल को नेक्स्ट वीडियो पाने के लिए। और ये इसका लिंक मैं यूट्यूब चैनल में दे दूंगा। इसका क्वेश्चन आप डाउनलोड कर सकते हैं पीडीएफ फाइल में। थैंक यू।